All right. Welcome everybody. This is episode number 24 of the Fully Remote Talkshow, the talk show for leaders adapting their style to a remote first world. And today in episode 24, we are talking about executive presence in virtual meetings. Again, how we show up and how we present ourselves has always been very important, and like how we establish ourselves as a leader, how we establish ourselves, how we influence people and everything around that. But now that we're doing all these meetings virtually, we're all restricted to this sort of screen space through which all communications are happening. Communications from these large keynote that you're doing to like thousands of people, to like the smaller audience with like, it's like the team presentations or like presentations where you're trying to influence people along with content, and the more one to few like high impact meetings like your sales conversations are all happening virtually as well. So how do we adapt ourselves to this virtual world, all happening in this small screen, and all we have is like a camera and a microphone? Can we get the same thing in this virtual space? That's the topic that we want to talk about today. And who better to talk about this than Julie? Julie, welcome to the show. uh,
Thank you.
for those of you who don't know Julie, she is a virtual keynote speaker. And there you go. You can see the Look Me in the Eye book right behind her. That's a book that she has written specifically about building relationships through camera, through this virtual world. So, as we are thinking about adapting this, and I think you've spent a lot of time specializing in sales and sales enablement and like virtual selling as well. So, we are super thrilled to talking to Julie today on the talk show.
Thank you, Arjun. I'm super thrilled to be here. Your focus being, remote first is in line with certainly what I've been working passionately on the past couple of years, and even prior to that, but with not quite as much buy-in as there was suddenly 2 years ago, right?
Right,
So
right. Yes, very excited. I'm going to sort of jump straight into this conversation over here, right? Like, so let's go into this setting over here about this. And again, for folks who are joining, feel free to raise hand. If you have any questions for me or for Julie, you can like come up on stage and ask these questions over here. But so Julie, so one of the first questions that come to my mind is like, why is this important? Like, why is this whole presence important? Especially like, it's like people who are, we talk to a lot of leaders who come from like a very technical or engineering background, for whom like, it's like the idea of presence and everything is sort of secondary compared to the content or like what goes over there. So I'm curious to like say, when you talk to like some of these leaders, how would you explain the importance of this to them?
well, yeah, and I guess that is the importance of whether it's virtual or whether you're communicating in person.
Right.
How important is your presence and what you bring to the table? And I would say it's grown significantly in importance as the world gets more competitive, right? I mean, it's not enough to just say words, right? If that were enough, we wouldn't need salespeople, we wouldn't need leaders, right? We give some people something to read and they go, oh, okay, got it. I'll go do that, right? That's not how it works. That's not how people work. So having that presence, having that ability to really influence, to motivate, to inspire is is part of what you bring and how you bring those words to life. And there's just some very significant differences between how you do that on camera and how you do that in person.
Right. So before I go into like sort of specific types of meetings, right, like the large meetings to the small meetings and everything, I want to just ask general your top tips for like what would be a good workplace setup for somebody who has a lot of presentations or like speaking. What is your workplace setup, and like what would you recommend for other people? Camera, their how they stand, how their background, everything.
Sure, and it all depends on, your circumstances, obviously, but there's just a couple of key things that you really need. And first of all, it's a good internet connection, right? That's required if you're going to do your job today, right? So that's a significant investment we want to make. A good external camera. I know
Mm,
so many people that are still using like that laptop camera, and it's typically not as good a quality.
mhm,
And if you think about, the goal is to make it easier for your audience to see you, to hear you, to connect with you. So anything that makes that experience more difficult or creates less of a in-person experience, you want to upgrade. So getting external camera allows you to position it in a way that's best for your audience. Getting a good microphone, that's again an external microphone that really allows people to hear you clearly. Having good lighting that allows
mm,
people to see your face and your eyes. So those aren't all super expensive investments anymore. There's a lot of product out there, and it changes so fast. I'm not going to throw any product names out at you, but
of course.
get something within your budget that's just is at the quality and HD quality, 1080 HD. And as far as backgrounds go, there whatever supports you. I my experience besides being in sales was as an actor,
Mm,
and background always meant, the supporting role. The background is not to overshadow you.
mm,
And so use something that really supports you. Like if you've got a lion behind you about ready to pounce,
mm,
that's going to distract me from your message, right? So you want to think about, what am I trying to convey, and am I is my setting doing this? Because this is really, as you said, this is your stage. This
right.
space here is your stage, and so you have to set that stage and be very intentional about it, because as you mentioned, we're taking away a big chunk of what we use to communicate with people.
Mhm,
It's like an iceberg. It's like the tip of an iceberg. If you just saw the tip, you'd go, "Oh, well, that's a nice, pretty white peak over there. Let's get a little closer."
mm,
But if you could see the whole thing, you may not want to get closer, because you're seeing that 80% that's below water that might wreck your ship,
mm,
right? So we've taken away 80% of our body language, and
mm,
everything we communicate has to happen in this space, this 20%. So I think it's really important to know, like, what does your 20% say? And that
right.
includes your setup, and your face and your body language and your energy and everything that goes along with that.
Right. I always see that, like, it's like you have an amazing, like, sort of gestures using your hands, like at least like making your hands visible to people. And I've heard everything from like how seeing somebody's hands is like helps to build trust and things around that. What about, like, sort of the gestures or the body language when it comes to this? I know there's severe limitations because of how small or how big you can see yourself on these screens, but does standing up, using gestures, all these things like help? How much of it that you do? How much of it that you would recommend other people do?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a lot of people struggle with that. And there's a lot of advice going around. Well, don't use your hands on video, and
Hmm.
so and that's really bad advice, because a lot of people, it's how they talk, it's how they think. It helps them express themselves, and so when you try not to use your hands and you're a gesturer, your energy has nowhere to go, and so that's when people get very wooden, and it's like, I'm trying not to use my hands. I'm trying not to use my hands, right? And that's not what we want. But what we want to do is try to channel that energy, and instead of using a lot of fast movement, vague movements, which the camera doesn't like, as you've seen, that it's very the latency and
Right.
it's very fleeting, and it's distracting. So it doesn't support what you're saying. So we want to use slower, more purposeful gestures, and we have to sort of develop this muscle memory of like what's in frame and what's out of frame. Because if you're constantly gesturing out of frame, it's a little distracting, and it's just a reminder that we're in this very artificial setting, and it takes us out of the moment. So learning, developing that muscle memory, and finding those gestures for you that are supportive. Maybe they're descriptive, like, I'm going to talk about two things today, or
Mm,
we're going to go from here to here with your business. Those are great uses of gestures. And so whether you're a gesture or not a gesture, you have to sort of adapt to the space.
Right. Great. This is awesome. I think these are good tips. I can almost see us like sort of capturing this in a way that we can immediately upgrade your presence by just using these tips. I want to jump in and like ask you about like sort of specific scenes over here, right? Like let's move to like a scene that supports that. Like one is around like um, when we are talking to like a large audience, and I'm talking
Mhm.
about like these keynote speeches, and like there are thousands of people in the audience. I mean, granted that like this was really hard to get any sort of audience reaction and everything, even when you are like on a stage, like you could barely see other people's reactions or so, but you
Right.
could still hear them, and that was always there. But what would you say, like, it's like, how would you adapt yourself when you're talking to like a large audience through virtual medium?
Right. And you know what? I just had that experience again this week because I was on a big stage talking to about 600 folks. And I was reminded that so many people say, oh, when I was talking to a group of people, I could see them. I couldn't see a thing because when you're on stage in a big audience and you have lights on you, you can't see what people are doing. And you don't have time to stop and check 500 faces, right? So,
Right.
so I think we've built up this, live, you can see so much,
Right.
maybe under certain circumstances. Uh, but it is different live because you have a lot more space to work and you have to be bigger, right, in order
Hmm.
to fill that space. And here again, we're still very tight. And so you have
Hmm.
this small space that you're working with, and you still have to bring that energy to this small
Hmm.
space, and you have to bring the emotion and the expression and the intentionality, and you have to look in the right place. What happens is, many people start trying to look at like they would in a live setting. They try to look at their whole audience. And if you're not looking at the camera, it won't feel like you're looking at anyone in your audience. And so that's kind of the beauty of the camera when it comes to large groups is if you look at the camera, because everyone is having their own personal experience with you. If you're
Hmm.
looking at the
Right.
camera, every person in that audience will feel like you are talking just to them.
Right.
And so people make that mistake so often. They'll start to, they're talking to Bob over here or Sharon, and Sharon doesn't know where she is on your screen, right?
Right. 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 Right.
So it's very powerful once you realize that, because even when you're in person, you can't talk to everybody in a room. Like
Yeah.
you can't. You try to talk to one part of the room, and so people feel sort of included, but they know you're not looking at them. Then you're gonna have to talk another part on camera. You got to talk to everybody all the time at once. So it's
Yep.
it's kind of special.
Yep. It's great. I want to like sort of ask more about that, right? Like so the advantage of doing, you mentioned one very good advantage in that, like now you could feel almost everybody feel like you're talking to them one on one, and that's like a great advantage of doing things virtually. Can we like leverage other advantages of doing this virtually that you is very hard to do in the real world? Some example that come to me is to say is like every time like I say something, I mean this is possible even in the real world, but it's harder, right? Like if I actually have to have like a sound effect or like something like a theme music that goes for me when I actually like talk, or maybe even something along the lines of like there's just like a graphics that's just like going over my head that's giving more information or anything. Of course, could just be distracting, but it could also add to the storytelling. It could enhance my presence. And are there people who are taking advantage of this medium to do that? And like, if so, what are some ways that you've seen? Curious to know.
Yes, I think that's a great example of ways to leverage this medium in certain instances. Like if you're talking to a group and you do have to, and it is perhaps an event or you're speaking and you want to make it just more engaging. There's not a lot of opportunity perhaps for direct interaction when you're talking to a large group. So using different methods to engage people, where you said whether it's something on screen to support you or to support what you said, to draw attention to something, as long as it's in sync with what you're talking about and the point you're
Mhm.
trying to make. Because, for example, when you're live, and I was working at a big event, and they put a lot of money into those production qualities, right? They
Right.
have professionals that have to set that up for you.
Right.
So we can do a lot of things on our own virtually that we weren't able to do in person when we just go meet with a group on our own.
Right. Um, yes. And when it comes to also like communication, right? Like I feel like, the virtual presence, like of course we can enhance a lot of things to like make our presence felt, but a lot of it is to do with like core communication skills, everything from like how you say that, like your storytelling. And this has been true even without virtual world, right? Like, so,
Mhm.
like the pausing, the how you frame sentences, all the things that I'm not great at, but I realize that, like, how well you can um, get how much important that is when you're giving these sort of big keynote speeches. You could inspire people by just the way you're saying things. Like a Barack Obama or a Martin Luther King, like, just comes to mind as like that kind of
Mhm.
presence over there, right? So
Right.
when it comes to all this is still important, of course, virtually. But what are some things that have changed now that we're doing this virtually? Like, what kind of communication skills have changed, or is this pretty much like the same list that we have to go with?
No, it's changed a lot because
Okay.
what works in person doesn't necessarily work virtually because the
Mm,
camera it sees things very differently. It picks things up that maybe people wouldn't pick up in person. When you're in, and it magnifies things, because think about it. If you're in person, nobody is staring at your face for half an hour,
mm,
right? They're looking around, they're taking in, there's a lot more context. Now we are in front of someone's face in this, medium close up, ideally,
mm,
and there's a lot of information we're giving off. And
mm,
if you're not aware of what information you're giving off, you're really operating in the dark.
mm,
So we have to be very in sync with what we're saying, and the camera is a lie detector. So if
mm,
you are trying to cover up the fact that you're nervous or you don't want to be there or you hate being on camera, like those things sort of tend to slip out, just in the
mm,
way you communicate, your facial expression, your eyes. And so we have to make sure that we are confident and we show up in the right energy level, as it
right.
were. And many people get uh, get very comfortable on camera, or their
Mm,
goal is to be comfortable. It's like, well, I just want to be myself. I just want to be comfortable. And the camera doesn't the camera doesn't read comfortable very well, because
mm,
the camera takes away a big chunk of your energy, that energy
mm,
that you have when you're in person. So if you bring less energy to your virtual calls,
mm,
and assuming you bring enough energy to your in-person calls, which a lot of people don't, and you're
mm,
seated, which is a low energy position, people
right.
tend to get really, just comfy, and then their energy goes down and they sit back, and so they don't look that interested, and their
Mm,
voice gets very monotone, and it's very hard to connect with someone that is not transferring energy. Sales is really a transfer of energy.
right.
Relationships are a transfer of energy. So you have to actually bring more energy to a virtual call. And I think a lot of people misunderstand that, thinking, well, I'll just, all I'm doing is, scooting over here and getting on camera and doing exactly what I did in person. And that's not going to be as effective, because it's a new medium, and a new
Right.
medium that reads things differently, which means your audience reads things differently, and we need to adapt to that.
Right. Makes a lot of sense. Yeah. This is great. I'm gonna jump to the sort of the next section around like these presentations to a smaller audience again, right? Like, this doesn't mean that it's like one-on-one, but more like maybe like in the tens to like around 20 people or so. And when you're like talking to them, um, things change. I mean, like this is not the same as like the keynotes speech over here, because this is, you're almost trying to build like relationships over here, not at like a very intimate level, but you're trying to impact, you're trying to influence these people in a way that is different than there. So
Hmm.
one of the key differences about this is like oftentimes presentations are blended with content, right? So I'm kind of curious to know about your thoughts on like how do you blend this content, whether it's like graphs and anything else that's aids in your storytelling, and your presence, your face, your like your camera presence over here. How do you
Hmm.
blend this? And of course, I mean, we think a lot about this because of the way that we've designed Zinc over here. But I'm curious to know,
Right.
like, how is this working for everybody?
Yeah. So I would say it's not working great for everybody because they don't have a good understanding of what needs to change and
Mm,
how people are coming to their screen and what they're looking at. As a presenter, you have to be very clear what you want your audience to look at
mm,
and direct them in that way. And because if you don't know, they won't know, right?
mm,
And so if I'm clear that I want them to look at this picture on the screen, I'm going to make sure, that I speak to that and say, and if you look on your right, you can see, there's an audience and, sitting around this table, and you can see the woman at the front pointing. I'm going to play that up, right? I'm going to make sure I'm not going to compete with it necessarily and make them wonder, well, am I supposed to look at the picture or her? So I want to do that, and then I also want to understand that whatever I put up on screen, people are going to try to read.
mm-hmm,
And if you are talking to some other point while they're trying to read, they're going to miss that or they're going to
mm-hmm.
get lost. And once you lose somebody virtually, that's a challenge to get them back. So understanding you don't want to put anything up until you want people to read it or see it. You have to be very precise on that. And then also, I think a lot of people think when they're presenting that if they've got something on screen, they've got a slide up or they've got some visual, that they don't need to look at the camera while they're talking.
Right.
They'll start to look at their presentation or their own pictures or slides. And part of that is because here it is right in front of your face. And it's very tempting, even though hopefully you know your slides, you know your content, you don't need to read it. But if it's right there, it's so tempting. And what happens is people will get what they need from your screen, the content, and then they'll look to you to bring it to life, to give it context. Like I can quickly see that picture, grasp it, presentation, smaller audience, and then look at this, and then I'm going to look to, you on the camera to tell me, why does that matter? Right?
Mm.
So remember, you are always on camera. And I think a lot of people forget that. They think, oh, they're, looking at the screen now, so I can too, or it doesn't matter where I look. And it does matter. You're never off camera once you're on camera.
Yeah. I love the point that you make about you are responsible for directing where they should be paying attention to. And it's actually something that like we often forget, even when we actually like put that thing in mind when we're designing this experience. We still like think, we don't think about that. um I love that, and I also like the fact that like even though there is content, your energy and your presence is like equally important in like conveying the message. um One of the things that we're doing over here as well, right? Like you notice how we're playing with screen real estate to give like relative
Mhm.
importance to different things. We do this with content all the time in slideshows and everything. Like there's like bigger content, smaller content, and like it's like the relative importance of it, and like so people pay attention. We're kind of doing the same thing with video over here. We want you to be like kind of the center stage, your center, and you're like your video is bigger, whereas mine is not. And so a very clear indication of somebody seeing this is to know that who should you be paying attention to. um,
Right.
and I think this is something that like we are obviously using to our advantage in this situation. But how much of that is getting lost? Is this an advantage in virtual that people should leverage but they're not? Or because this doesn't exist in the real world, right? Like in the real world, you're who you are, you're always the same size. But here we can change that. We can make it so that like you're more important or more central than the other people over here.
Right,
So
right.
talk to me about that as to like how we can leverage this.
Yeah, well, I think there's it speaks to a lot of subconscious cues that we're giving people, right? And there's a lot of power in that. And again, you're helping people understand where they should focus
Hmm.
in a subtle way. You're not saying, look in the center. You're making that picture bigger and or more compelling, or however you're manipulating it. And so there's power in that. And again, just being very intentional about what you're doing, and and I think it also adds to the variety, because there is because people are just, you have this screen real estate and there's only so much you can do in
Hmm.
this space. um, Adding some variety helps with attention levels, so it
Hmm.
can sort of re-engage people that might be starting to go down that natural uh, curve of attention that we all go through after a few minutes. And so using some way every few minutes to re-engage people
Right.
is of great importance virtually.
This is great, and this is actually like a great segue into like the other question that I had was around like engagement and like how important
Mm.
this is, right? Like especially in this kind of a presentation scenario, I think in the keynote case it's like very hard for you to like involve the audience more than just like a say yay or say no or something of that sort. But over
Right.
here you have an opportunity to like make move people from being these passive observers to like sort of active contributors, engaged audience. uh, what is your top tricks in your bag that you actually use to like bring audience from just that I'm just like turning off my camera and like gonna go sit in a corner to like I'm gonna sit in the edge of my seat and like be part of this presentation? What are the tricks that you would use?
Well, I think the first thing is to not be afraid of the way your audience presents themselves.
Mm.
Most people, when they're in front of a camera, have a very uh, sort of blank expression. I call it resting business face. And it's not necessarily a reflection of how they feel about what you're saying. It's more of how
Mhm.
we have been trained by media to sit when we're in front of a screen. Think about it. If you're, mostly when we're in front of a screen, we're watching TV, we're looking, going through our tablet, scrolling, we're consuming content. So that's the passive state that people sit in front
Mhm.
of their screen with, especially if they're expecting a presentation, right?
Right.
They're not there to it's only been very recently that we've had this two-way conversations going virtually, so that is an instilled behavior. So and the problem is when people see that very passive face, they think, oh no, they're bored, they don't like this, and then
Right.
it just brings out the worst in us. We rush and we don't ask questions because we're afraid of that silence, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the first thing I would say is understand that people show up in a different way on camera.
Mm.
So just because we know better and we should use our good, video skills, most people don't. And so they're
Right.
going to show up that way. And so not being afraid of that. And instead, um, I'm going to have a better chance of engaging you if I assume you are on the edge of your street and you are interested to
Mm.
hear what I have to say, because that's going to bring out the best in me. And maybe you didn't even start out that interested, but I'm bringing my best, so I have a better chance of drawing you in. So that's the first thing. And and then also understanding again how your audience is connecting with you. And if
Mm.
you feel like your audience is not engaging, the first thing I ask people to do is check your eye contact. Are you looking at
Mm.
the camera? Because there's a subtle thing that happens to us when, even though we're in this virtual environment, we know that the person is not sitting across from us. If you're looking at your camera, I almost feel like I got to sit up straighter. They're looking at me. I got to pay attention. Right? There's a
Right.
sense of obligation. So using that camera to really Make your audience feel like they are a participant
Mm,
in this. Like, I'm talking to you, which means I also have to leave those spaces when I ask questions, even if I don't expect an answer. I have to
mm,
throw out a question, say, so, how do you feel about virtual presentations?
right.
Yeah, and I
Uh,
gotta let them think through an answer and kind of go through that process. And as an actor, I was learned that there's there's no there's never just we're never just talking to one person or talking to ourselves. Even a
mm,
monologue where an actor is talking to himself is talking to another person. It's just their part is silent. So
mm.
you're always trying to communicate, to get something across, to get understanding, to get, someone excited about what you're saying. And so that creates that communication loop. If you really feel like your audience is there and they're listening and you're reaching them.
Love it. I think this is incredible to like hear about, like thinking about from like the audience perspective, just wearing their hats over there. And one of the things along those lines as well, right? Like I feel like I'm almost sort of guilty in many meetings when I actually go, is like I tend to like sort of be like, I love the term resting business face. I feel
Yeah,
like I've done that a lot. So
sure.
now that I'm like talking to you, I'm kind of feeling that, like, saying, hey, you're looking at me, so I need to like nod or do anything. So what is the audience perspective? Like, so if you are in the side of like, what is the best way for you to be a good participant in a meeting,
Mm.
not just the person who's presenting. And one of the things, like, it's like you might have noticed that like we have certain things that gives the people the ability to convey what they're thinking. Like, it's like you made a joke, like people could just like laugh. There's like a subtle laugh track that comes over here. These are like ability for people to just like sort of react to what it is. But are these I mean, this plus what else is better, a way to be a good participant in a meeting?
Yeah, I think virtual tools like that are, they're fun, they're engaging. And I think you need a lot of variety virtually, especially if you've got a big audience, right? You got to work a little harder to keep people engaged. You don't want to make it too complicated, or then people just give up, right?
Right,
We got this, and then you got that, and then raise your hand and do this emoji.
right.
So you want to make it very simple, and be very clear with what you expect from your audience. I would say, you train your audience in that first minute how you expect them to
Mm,
participate with you. And so if you talk nonstop for 5, 10 minutes without asking a question, and then you answer your own question, which a lot of people do because they can't take that silence, you've just trained your audience that they don't have to participate.
mm,
Right? Or if you ask people to, raise your hand if this is of interest to you, and they don't raise it fast enough, or they don't put something in chat fast enough, it's always a lag time. As a presenter, you're like, oh my gosh, did anyone hear me? Right? Yeah, but you have to take that into account, because if you jump the gun and say, well, here's what I think, again, people are like, well, she's not really listening. She didn't really want my answer. So
right.
you have to understand audience time and presenter time. And audience time is, they just heard the question. They weren't expecting a question. They didn't have their hand on the keyboard ready to type. They've got to think about
Mhm.
what they want to say or how they feel about what you said. We have to allow time for that, and not be so anxious to get on with things.
Right. No, this is good. I almost feel like I'm guilty of so many of these things. This is what is running in my head when I'm like hearing these things. But this is awesome. I mean, I now have like a great recipes coming out of this, as to like, it's like, hey, what can we do better over here? Shifting gears to like sort of the last section, and I'm like trying to like hustle over here because we are running out of time over here. But this is
Sure.
probably your forte here, around like high impact sales kind of communications, where the goal is to be human, build that connection, build that trust, and like be there. um, what would you say are like the top tips when you are going into one of these calls, especially from like a virtual selling perspective?
Mm. Yeah, that's a really important question, because when you have an opportunity to speak to someone and you're trying to influence, whether in sales or as a manager, what have you, you need to make the most of that opportunity. You can't, you can't just throw it to chance and do what you did in person. So a couple things that we need to consider is that when you are trying to build a relationship and be seen as a credible, trusted advisor or manager, um, those things are based on oftentimes feelings, right? And we get those feelings based on certain cues. And some of those are things like direct eye contact. Like we, there's surveys or research that shows that we associate direct eye contact with confidence, and we associate it with people telling us the truth. And when people are averting their gaze, we associate that with not telling the truth. Now, that may not be true for, with everybody, but that's how we've been trained ever since we were, babies. If someone was looking at us, they were paying attention, they were, confident, they were trustworthy. And you take that away, you're really operating at a deficit. And so a lot of times people say, well, people know I'm looking at their image. And it's like, well, first of all, I don't know too many people, especially in sales, too many customers that are going to make excuses for you, right? If they bother to think about why you're not looking at them at all.
Right.
And secondly, it's not relationships, trust, credibility is not based necessarily on logic. It's based a lot on emotion.
Right.
And so that's what you're working with. So can you build a relationship without looking at someone, without, with darting around, looking suspicious and not, showing hands and being authentic on camera or in a way that the camera reads that, or having great energy? Yeah, you can, but that's really the hard way to do it. And in sales, when you have to build a relationship quickly, that's, you're really shooting yourself in the foot.
Got it. No, I think the impact of how important this relationship building virtually, because we've talked to like so many people who've run like meetings for different types, right? Like there's like the meetings for ideation, brainstorming. There's like meeting for alignment, and there's meeting for learning, or like all of those things. All of that done virtually, I think like has come a long way. But the most difficult of them is the kind of meetings where you need to build relationships, like the bonding meetings, and like the ones that involve like trust building and influencing meetings. Those are like the most tough ones when we're doing virtually, because as you rightly said, we have so many like cues that we're tuned to as even as kids, mm, uh, to look for how we build trust. So any tips over there that actually like helps do that well virtually is gold mine there, because it's like one of the hardest things to do.
It
And
is.
I like,
And
yeah,
Harvard Business Review did a report on that, and they said it is more difficult to build relationships virtually. It's true.
right,
And that's because, like you said, we don't have, people that we knew in person and then we're working with virtually. Like those relationships tend to survive because people
right,
have that human connection with you. So we have to start from scratch with new relationships and understand how our audience, our customer, our team is experiencing us on their screen, and how can we break through this screen and really connect with them in ways that make them feel heard, seen, and understood. And that's really the key to a relationship, right?
right. Uh, no, this has been great. I feel like we've covered like a whole bunch of these things. Any other like sort of top takeaways that like I missed on and like that you would want to share? I would love to hear your thoughts on like um, how to come across great on camera. What else did we miss?
Oh gosh, it just depends on how you're using video. So there's all different, specific tips for different things. I would say that one of my favorite tips that people don't realize is your performance on camera starts before the camera goes on. because you can't go from 0 to 100, like that. And so it's really important to warm up again, because this all people are seeing is this much of you. So you have to make sure you're able to express yourself, that you have, your body is open and free, and your energy is up, so that you can express yourself at your best. And to get to that best state, you have to warm up before you get on camera. And so if you ever see actors before a show or before a shoot, they're not just sitting there waiting to go on. They're back there, they're moving, they're, vocalizing, they're keeping things loose and open, so that once they're on, they're already in role. And so that's the same kind of energy and preparation we need to bring to our on camera work.
I like that. I know I've done ever. I mean, right before the show goes on, like I'm like last 10 minutes, I'm like up and standing and like doing this, and I actually the days
Good.
that I don't do it, I notice how like it takes a while for me to boot up, and I
Yes.
cannot like be there, and so I
Yes.
notice that a lot. Yep.
Yeah. And those
Uh,
those first few seconds are so important, because that's when people are forming that first impression, right?
right.
So
Yes.
if you're not warming up ahead of time, you're warming up on your audience, and that's a really expensive way to warm up.
Right. Makes a ton of sense. This has been awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm just gonna jump to this last scene over here. One second, I'm having a bit of a lag here.
Well, I love all the different pop-ups here. It's very interesting. A lot of variety.
Yeah, the goal is to like again keep it live, keep it active, and everything. So before I kind of thank you, I want to just like remind folks about this. What's coming up next week? We are talking to Kevin Hoffman about specifically about meeting design for remote first organizations. How do you design meetings? This could be like both how do you structure your meetings as well as sort of like physically design your presentations and everything as well. We're going to talk to Kevin about this same time next week, Thursday, 5 p.m. on August 4th. So please tune in at that time. With that, I will um, wrap up over here. And thank you so much for joining us today, Julie. For folks who are here, if you had any top takeaways, please share them to the side of the screen that you're seeing. But Julie, this was a pleasure having you on this show.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's so nice to talk to somebody who has the same passion for being more effective in the remote virtual world.
Yes, I think you've given me a lot of newer ideas as we talked about over here in terms of how we can leverage this technology to increase presence and increase how we come across. I mean, like our big vision is to say that like environment plays a huge impact in how people behave, and like if we change the environment, we can change how people behave, and so that's one of the big
Mm,
reasons why we are doing this in the first place. So many ideas came up in this conversation. Thanks so much
great,
for
great.
sharing this, and our audience are going to love this too.
My pleasure.
All right, folks, that's it for today. I'll see you later, and Julie, I'll follow up with you offline to like share the video to once it's ready.